Thanks everyone for joining me today for upgrading Angular applications. And Angular is really hot right now. A lot of interest in Angular, but one of the first questions that people have when they look at using Angular 2 is, well, how do I get from here to there in order to upgrade my applications and get all the way to Angular 2? So I'm going to take you through the process and also discuss a number of the concepts that you need to know as we make our way there. So as you take a look at the sample and the code that I'll be showing you today, if you go up to GitHub onto my account where Angular upgrade demo, you can go ahead and clone that repository, copy it, fork it, whatever you would like to do. And I'll be showing this location a few times throughout the presentation, but everything that you see me do is available to you up on GitHub. Now, when we're talking about Angular, particularly Angular 2, it's not released yet, but it is in release candidate. And in fact, in the last 2 or 3 days, I believe, RC3 has shipped. And that included some performance improvements as well as the Angular 2 router, which is we've been waiting for a little while. But basically, the API is pretty stable. And so everything that you see here today, I can't guarantee it, but most likely will not change because we're pretty far into the release candidate for Angular. And we're making our way to a final production version of Angular 2. Now, when we're talking about Angular 1 and Angular 2, it really kind of is like two worlds colliding. Angular 1 is set up a certain way. Angular 2 is quite a bit different. It's not just a few breaking changes. It's not just a few APIs that are different. The concepts and the fundamentals of many of the things that you're trying to accomplish when building your applications in either framework are generally the same, but the implementation details of how they work and how they interoperate together are fundamentally different. So what we need to be able to do is to have a way to take an existing Angular 1 application and instead of have the expectation of having to wholesale rewrite the thing from scratch, rather what we'd like to do is be able to take pieces of it and upgrade only certain components from Angular 1 to Angular 2 until we get to the point that everything is upgraded and then we have an Angular 2 application. So if you think about a standard application, this blue outline represents an application boundary, and you might have a SPA, and inside that it has a controller and maybe a directive, and there's lots of different components that go into an application. Now I'm going to use a color scheme, a color coding setup here as we go through the presentation. So when you see blue, that represents Angular 1, and when you see red, that will represent Angular 2. And the idea is we have this Angular 1 application, and what we'd really like to do is take this middle component, maybe it's a directive, and upgrade that to Angular 2. So we have a full Angular 1 application. We want to have just one piece of it be Angular 2. And then you can do that, but notice how I have this arrow here that shows that it needs to be downgraded in order to work within Angular 1. And that's the essential piece of being able to make these two frameworks work together within the same context, is that you need a bridge or you need some sort of adapter that is able to facilitate the communication between the two different frameworks. So you could even have maybe a larger piece of your application built within Angular 2 and you want to bring that in to your Angular 1 app. You can have all of those components working together just exactly the way they would even if Angular 1 wasn't a part of the process. But then when you bring it into your Angular 1 application, you downgrade the root component that you would use within that application to make it work within Angular 1. So the idea is that the base level, the most root level application will always be Angular 1 until everything is upgraded and converted to Angular 2. And by doing that, you're able to use a bridge that will allow the two frameworks to talk to one another for the components that are implemented in the different originating frameworks. But eventually what you'll want to do is just keep going and use different pieces in different ways. So let's say that we have this Angular 2 application and we wanted to really use an Angular 1 directive within that Angular 2 component. Well, the bridging feature gives you that ability to kind of mix and match services, directives, components any way that you want to say that if I need to use something from Angular 1 in Angular 2, you can do that. So here I'm showing you that we have, maybe it's a directive that you want to use within an Angular 2 component. You can upgrade that so that it works with Angular 2. And then as you begin working within your application, you can start refactoring and re-implementing each one of the components. And once you get to the situation to where everything in the application is now running as Angular 2, then you can take out the bridge and you finally have an actual Angular 2 application. So that's kind of the high level concept of how this all works. So we'll dive down into it a little bit deeper. When you look at upgrading to Angular 2, you're going to have at least two major phases to your development effort. The first one is preparation. So depending on how you write your Angular code, it may be better suited to upgrade to Angular 2 than other ways. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. But ultimately, what you want is to get your code base of Angular 1 to be as close to what it will essentially be in Angular 2, and that's found in the form of components and services. So when we look at the versions of Angular 1 that are available, before you go to upgrade, you want to be able to be on the latest version of Angular possible. That may or may not be possible for you in your situation, but you at least want to get up to Angular 1.5 because that introduces Angular 1's components API. And so as you look at the different controllers and directives that are implemented in your application, you want to be able to have those refactored and existing as components so that you have basically just two different types of components working with your application. One component might be Angular 1, one component might be Angular 2, but at least you're working with an apples to apples type of situation. So I'll show you some of what's needed in order to prepare your application for an upgrade. And one of the other things too is you can write Angular 2 a number of different ways. You can do it in straight JavaScript, you can do it in Dart, but most likely you're probably going to use TypeScript. And so you can also begin introducing TypeScript into your Angular 1 application if you haven't already. But once you've gone through all the preparation steps and your Angular 1 application is set and ready to communicate with Angular 2, then you can begin the upgrade process. And here again, what you want to do is to look at your application in terms of components, and by taking individual pieces and upgrading them to Angular 2, piece by piece, you can maybe take off big chunks as it makes sense for you, but you want to make sure your tests are passing. You want to make sure that you're not changing any functionality. You want to make sure that you're just doing an upgrade from Angular 1 to Angular 2. And the nice thing about what they provided for us in the upgrade adapter is that you can do it at very small increments. So the name of the game is components. And if you're going to use TypeScript, you can go ahead and upgrade some of your components to TypeScript. So let's look at some code here. This is a controller that this type of syntax is probably fairly familiar to you, is what you might see in a lot of tutorials. And this is probably a starting point for a lot of people's applications. The one problem that we have in here, though, is the use of scope. Now, scope will give us some problems as we want to make our way up to implementing components within Angular, because scope isn't used within components. So lucky for us, the controller as syntax for controllers gives us the ability to not inject scope and use this keyword in the constructor function in order to access all of its members. So here, the controller's been refactored, we've taken out scope, and we still have the same service that's being injected into the controller. We're using this keyword. Things get a little squirrely as we get down into this closure and want to keep the context for this. But for the most part, we have a pretty clean controller at this point. So once we've done that, then it's an easier step to implement this. Instead of a controller, what we'd like to do is implement it as a Angular 1.5 component. So you'll notice the difference here that as a component, this returns an object rather than a constructor function. And we have a way to access the URL of the template for this component. And I've also gone ahead and moved this up at this point to using TypeScript. And once we move over to the Angular code, you'll notice that this looks eerily familiar to what you might see within Angular 2. So here the controller is implemented as this ng1 list controller. And then just as we did before in the constructor, going off and getting some data from the service and then putting it into the data member. The nice thing about using TypeScript, though, is we can use the arrow function here, and this keeps the context of the this pointer and kind of cleans up the code a little bit. So this is how a controller might look after you've prepared it and got it ready to go up to Angular 2. So as you're working with your application, you might say, okay, well, everything's prepared, everything's ready to go. Now what we want to do is take this component and we want to upgrade just this one to Angular 2. So that might look like this. So here I have the import statements for a component and the on init interface, and then I've got an interface for the data of how I'll return it, and then I have a service that I want to use. Here's the component decorator function that allows me to say what selector will be used in the application, and then of course the template URL. And then instead of doing everything in the constructor, I can just handle the on init event and go off to my service, get all the data, and set it equal to the data member. So that's how I would take that controller from the earliest type of setup, use controller as syntax, move it up to an Angular 1.5 component, and then once you're ready to begin working with Angular 2, you can implement the same functionality using the Angular 2 syntax. Now, there's some special preparation that you have to do in the application so that it all works together, and I'll show you that in just a moment, but let's also take a look at a directive. Now, this is kind of familiar to the components that we saw. So directives are a little bit easier to prepare and also upgrade to Angular 2. So if we took this and moved it into a component, you'll notice that we still have the template URL. Bindings is now what we have in order to bring the inputs in, and instead of scope. And here we just have your basic controller. So this is an Angular 1.5 component, prepared and ready to go into Angular 2. And so if we were to upgrade this into Angular 2 syntax, we would have this component for our directive. Instead of bindings, over here we have the input decorator function saying that we have data that will be coming in this way. And basically everything else is pretty much the same. But the idea is that we want our controllers and directives implemented as components so that they can work and interoperate with components in Angular 2. So when you have that when you have all that set up correctly, then what you'll want to do is bootstrap your application running in what's called a hybrid mode. And so that's giving us all of our components rather than controllers and directives, and also implementing everything as a service. So instead of having factories and providers, we want to make sure everything's implemented as a service. And once we have that available, then we can manually bootstrap up our application because that's how it needs to happen in order to get the two frameworks running together. And once that's done, then we can use the upgrade adapter in order to make sure that the communication works between the two different frameworks. So let's talk about that upgrade adapter a little bit more. It has a number of different responsibilities in order to make sure that the two frameworks interoperate together correctly. So the first one is dependency injection. So as you set up your application, you'll tell it that there's different there's different components that you want to make available to the whole of the website, whether that's Angular 1 or Angular 2. But when you implement a component and it asks for something as a dependency, it'll just say, hey, I need XYZ service. Well, the upgrade adapter will have all of the different components registered in it for the dependency injection. And so no matter what framework is asking for a dependent a component, it'll know where to find it and will be able to provide the instance of that component. It needs to be able to handle projection and transclusion because as you have content that shows up inside of different components that come from different places, it'll need to manage that and make sure that it knows how to keep track of what goes where. The upgrade adapter also needs to be able to handle component nesting. So if you have different components that are all in the same framework, that works great. You might also have a directive inside of another directive that come from two separate versions of Angular, and so it handles the back and forth for that as well. When we're dealing with change detection and data binding, it will handle all of that information, and then also has an API for upgrading and downgrading components, as well as bootstrapping the application. So before we get into the code, let's just take a look at the API a little bit closer. The first thing that you'll notice off of the upgrade adapter is that it has a method called add provider. And what this does is it gives you the opportunity to register Angular 2 providers so that you can use them in Angular 1. So if you have a service built in Angular 2 and you want to use that in Angular 1, you start off by passing it in to add provider to register it with the upgrade adapter. Then we'll bootstrap the application by telling it the application name and also the resources that it needs to have available to it. And using the upgrade adapter, its bootstrap method was what will allow the tie between the two frameworks to work correctly. Now, if you have a component that's built in Angular 2 and you want to use it in Angular 1, we'll use the downgrade ng2 component method for that, as well as if you have a provider or a service that you want to make available to Angular 1 that was written in Angular 2, you can downgrade that and make it available to the rest of the app that way. And the same goes for things that are written in Angular 1. You can upgrade it to make it available in Angular 2 for components, as well as providers or services. You want to be able to make those available in Angular 2. All right, so now let's take a look at the demo and some code. Okay, so this is what's available up on GitHub. And what you'll see here is I've got a few different apps running. So this is your typical standard Angular 1 application. So I've got a root component, and then I have a directive in that, and then all the data is coming from an Angular 1 service. Then I have my standard Angular 2 application. So I've got the root components, the directive, and data that comes from an Angular 2 service. And then over here I have them working together. So the first one that you'll see is an Angular 1 component using an Angular 1 directive, but the data is coming from an Angular 2 service. Down here, I have an Angular 1 component using an Angular 2 directive, and the data is coming from the Angular 1 service. But come over to this side, I've got an Angular 2 component using an Angular 1 directive, data coming from an Angular 2 service. And then the last one, everything is in Angular 2 except for the data. The Angular 1 service is providing the data for both the component and the directive. So I'll show you the ways that we can set this up in order to make this mixing and matching available. But the practical use of all of this, and I built this to be very easy so that you can see by colors and naming where everything comes from. But the practical use of building and setting up your applications this way, again, is so that you have an existing Angular 1 app. You can just find pieces of it that you want to begin to upgrade. And then once you've upgraded, you can allow it to interoperate with the rest of the system. Let's go ahead and take a look at the code here. Got a lot of stuff open. All right, so let's start off with Angular 1. So here's your basic HTML page. And you'll notice that I'm bringing in Angular 1 through a regular script reference and then declaring the module. Then I have my service and my two components that I'm bringing in and then manually bootstrapping it. At this point, I don't necessarily have to manually bootstrap it. I could use the attribute up here where we normally say ng app and go on from there. But I just want to show you how you can do it in Angular 1 as well as Angular 2, because as you do a hybrid app, they both, it needs to be bootstrapped manually. But this is the HTML file. This is standard stuff that you've probably seen over and over again. And as we look at the different implementations, I've again tried to keep things consistent so that when you look at file names and even data that's coming back, you can very clearly see where everything came from. So for my Angular 1 application, I have the app module here that declares the application, and we'll go in and bootstrap it here. So on the document ready event, we're bootstrapping the application. And what that will do is load in the app itself. So we have two components that work together. And this is the code that you saw on the slide, exactly the same thing. So this is the list controller. It goes out and gets the data from the service and makes it available to the component itself. We take a look at the HTML. This is just a simple ng repeat, and it uses the ng1 item directive and passes that data into its scope, or its bindings actually, through this expression right here. So the item in the loop will get passed into the directive. And when we take a look at the directive itself, or it's technically a component, but we would think of it as a directive. Here it's coming, the data is coming in through the bindings, and then once it's done, it renders itself by just putting out this HTML and doing the data binding. So that's the basics of the Angular 1 application. If we take a look at the Angular 2, up here, what we need to bring in, of course, are the polyfills so that Angular 2 can work with some older browsers. So we've got that directly out of the quick start. And then down here, we're using system.js as the component loader in order to load each one of the components. So there's no script references here to the different modules that we load in for Angular 2. That's all maintained through the module loader. And in this case, we're using system.js. So as the application boots up, we'll load up this app, and this comes over here to main TS. And here I bring in the Bootstrap function from Angular Platform Browser Dynamic. This tells the application that this is a browser app. With Angular 2, you can bootstrap your app as a server app, as a mobile application, or a browser app. And here I'm bringing in app component. This is the root of the app itself, and then bootstrapping up the application like this. Now, you will not run code like this until your whole application is completely Angular 2 code. So you will start it up a different way when you're either running hybrid or obviously as Angular 1. But if we come up here to app components, this sets everything up that we need for the app itself. So it declares the selector saying that's ng2 app. And then I have the list components that we're making available, and then the service in order to get the data. So if we look at the HTML, it's just basically declaring the ng2 list. And as we come down to the list, this just brings in the service. So we'll start at the top here, bring in component and then the on-init interface so that I can handle that event as the component is executed. And then bring in the interface for the data itself, the component, which is the directive that it will use as it lists out each one of those items, and then the service. So importing each one of those, making that directive available in the directive array, and then setting up the class. So once this initializes, then it goes out to the ng2 service, it gets all of its data and sets it equal to the data member. So basically the exact same thing that we were doing in the earlier incarnations of this type of component. If we look at the HTML, instead of the ng each, we're using ng4. And this is using the Angular 2 syntax for this. And you'll notice that we have the square brackets doing the data binding. And this just works as we would use in any other directive within Angular 2. So it's passing the instance of this item into the data member. And so as we take a look at the item component, you'll see here that this is decorated as an input. So as that data item comes in, it's equal to this member. And then it will go up and provide all this information up to its template. And so as we walk up to the template, this is basically the same exact thing as you saw before. We're just data binding out the title so that you can see it. So that's the two different approaches. We've got Angular 1 and Angular 2, and basically the same types of files and components that are working. So now let's see how they work together. So let's start off with the HTML file. So the first thing that you'll notice is that I'm using a script reference to bring in Angular 1, which is exactly what we would expect. All of our Angular 1 code is just JavaScript. It's not any sort of ES5 modules or anything like that. So Angular 1 here is brought in using the script reference, as well as the module itself, the service, and the two components that I'm using. So those are all done through regular script references. At the same time, I'm bringing in the polyfills that I need for Angular 2. So once Angular 2 is up and running within the app, it's going to need those polyfills to make sure our older browsers can keep up. And so once all of those scripts are loaded, then I go into system.js and tell it to start off my hybrid application here. I'm naming it ng1, ng2. What this will do, we'll go up into the app and it'll start off with main TS. And let me just collapse some of these so that we don't get ahead of ourselves and talk about what's going on here. So this is the main entry point of the application, and this is where everything begins to get set up for the hybrid app. So some import statements here up at the top. I'm bringing in my Angular 2 service. So I want to use my Angular 2 service, but eventually it'll be used within Angular 1 components. So I have some special things that I want to do with that. And you can see that here already with add provider. I have my Angular 2 item component. This is the item directive written in Angular 2, but I want to use that in my Angular 1 component. So I'm going to handle that a little bit special as well. And then also my app component, which kind of sets up the whole root of the Angular 2 application. And then I'm also importing in upgrade adapter. Now let's look at that for just a moment. The reason that this is set up the way it is because the upgrade adapter will be used in different parts of the application. And you want to make sure that you use the exact same instance of upgrade adapter throughout your app. If you go and create new versions of it, then all of the registrations, the dependency injection, everything that it's using to collaborate between the two different frameworks won't work. So by putting this in its own module and exporting out an instance of upgrade adapter right here, now I know that I can just import it in any other module that I'm using and I have the same instance. So we just find that in Angular/upgrade, get access to the class itself, new that up, and then export it out from this module. So now that I have upgrade adapter, I can start preparing the application so that it knows how to work with the different frameworks. So let's go back to the browser for just a moment. I want to focus in on this area right here. So we've got an Angular 1 component. It's got that Angular 1 directive with it, but it's getting data from an Angular 2 service. So if we go back to the code, the first thing that we're doing here is telling the upgrade adapter that I want to add in a provider, and this is the Angular 2 service. So this is the first step that I need to do in order to prepare it to work with an Angular 1 application. So just like we do in Angular 1, I'm calling angular.module and giving it a module name. And then what I can do is take the instance of that app and then call factory and say that I'm passing in something that I'm calling ng2 service. Then I can use upgrade adapter, downgrade ng2 provider, and then pass in the class that I imported in from ng2 service. So after doing this, now it's available to be used within Angular 1. So if I were to come over here to my ng2 list component, this is the class that is implemented for, bring up my browser. So this area right here, this list component, this is the class that we're looking at the moment for that. So what's happening is I have some dependency injection happening here within this constructor. Now this is just normal everyday Angular 2 type of dependency injection. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong file. I need to be looking over at this one here because we're talking about the ng1 component. Sorry about that. So this is the class that I need. So again, just to backtrack for 1 second, we're looking at the class that's applied for this list. So here I have my standard TypeScript class that I've created. And what I need to do is have access to the Angular 2 service. And so by adding it into the factory here and downgrading it by giving it this key, now when I go back to this class and use $inject, I can get access to it using that item. And so that's what will provide it into the constructor from here. So the upgrade adapter will find the instance of it and provide it. And then just like normal, when I'm looking for my ng1 service, I add that into the array here as well. So now within this one controller, I can access a service that was implemented in Angular 1, as well as one that was implemented in Angular 2. So that's how you get a chance to use a service that's coming from Angular 2 down to Angular 1. So now let's take a look at the next one. When we go down here, I've got my Angular 1 component. And this time, what I want to do is use a directive that was implemented in Angular 2, which is essentially a component. So when we come back up to this list, all of the data is being provided here within the constructor. And when I go into the HTML, you can see that I've got this ng2 item that is within the template that I have for the list. So by making that available within the upgrade adapter, I'll have it for use here. But notice that even though I'm in an Angular 1 component, I'm still using the Angular 2 data binding syntax. So I need these square brackets around this, this attribute in order for this to work. So I can use it here within Angular 1, and what makes that available is registering it here through the upgrade adapter, and I downgrade the ng2 component. So that's the directive, and it needs to be cast to the Angular I directory factory and then passed into the directive function here. By giving it this key, this is what eventually will be snake cased and be available within my within the view as ng2-item. So this line of code gives me the ability to access the Angular 2 directive, and this line of code up here gives me the ability to access the Angular 2 service. So now when we go over to the next item here, we have the Angular 2 component, and we want to use the Angular 1 directive inside of that. Now we can go back over to that other class that we were looking at a moment ago. So this is what's implemented in order to bring everything together for the list for Angular 2. Now, what I need injected into this class is a service that's implemented in Angular 1. So if we look at the imports up here, we'll see that kind of the common suspects. We've got a data contract for the data that comes through. I'm bringing in the directive for the Angular 2 directive and also the Angular 2 service, but I also have the Angular 1 components. And so by importing this, let's take a look at this item. You'll notice that here is where I'm calling upgrade Angular 1 component for the directive that I'm using as well as for the service. So when I import this in, it will upgrade each one of those items and make them available to Angular 2. And so I put all of that into this module so I can import those all at once. So once that directive is available, I can add that in to the directives array of the component by importing in through that statement. And then this controller can happily work with a directive from Angular 1 as well as Angular 2. Now the service that I want to bring in, I brought in through the upgrade statement that came in through this imports. And in order to inject it into the controller itself, I need to use this decorator function of inject so that it knows to go and look for the service based off of this key. And so when we look at, let's look at this again. So by telling it that it's the ng1 service, that will register it in the registry, and so it can be found here through the decorator function in order to get the instance. So once this class is created, an instance of the ng2 service as well as the ng1 service will be available, and then on initialization, I can just use it just like normal. And so once all of that is set up, then I can go in and begin using the data from ng2 using the Angular 1 directive. Now, this is interesting as well. We're here within Angular 2, but we're using an Angular 1 directive. We still need to use the Angular 2 data binding syntax in order to make it to work correctly. Wasn't exactly the same on the other side of the coin, but here, even though it's an Angular 1 directive or component, we're going to use the Angular 2 data binding syntax. And the same thing down here for, of course, what would be a native Angular 2 directive found within this component. And so if we go back to main TS, we have all of our downgrades happening here. And then the last thing that we need to do is to take the actual app itself, the root level of the Angular 2 component, and downgrade that so that it's available to be used within Angular 1. So once I have that, I have ng2 app, and that then can work within the application. So then everything gets bootstrapped here by calling upgrade adapter, bootstrap, telling it that I want to go against the document element. This is the same name here that's defined up there. So that way it knows what application to look for. And this is asynchronous. So once this is done, then you have this callback that you can call and then do anything else that you need to once the bootstrapping is done. So let me just kind of recap here for 1 second. Oops. Let's find the right slide. So we're starting off with a base level Angular 1 application, and we have different parts of it that we want to be Angular 2. So those are downgraded in order to work with Angular 1. And then as we can go and replace different parts of the application and refactor them into Angular 2, all of those can be made available, downgraded into work with Angular 1. And then once all of it has been refactored and all of it's been upgraded to Angular 2, then you have a full Angular 2 application, and you don't need the upgrade adapter at that point. So before we dive into some questions, I'm going to give you a few resources to check out. And so again, I think somebody even already asked for the GitHub location. So that's right here, just github.com/Craig Shoemaker, Angular-upgrade demo. You'll have access to everything there. I encourage you to check out the official documentation found on Angular's website about upgrading. But I will warn you that the code sample that's included within this is wrong. So all the concepts that are in there are really worthwhile and gives you even more detail than what I've given you here. But just know that if you try to go line by line and the code sample gives you, it's going to head you in a really strange direction. So I've talked to some people who can hopefully make some changes in that regard. But just be aware if you go there, there's lots of good information, but don't go for the code sample. The next resource I'd like to mention to you is that Joe Eames is producing courses for Pluralsight regarding this whole topic, and he gets into explicit detail of working with particularly production level applications. So I just wanted to give you the basics and the high level of how this all works. But he has 2 courses that he's producing, and one course is entirely on preparing your applications to moving towards Angular 2. And so that's available today. He's got a sister course that's going to be coming out soon that's all about the upgrade portion of it, of how you would upgrade, each component line by line and how that would work. So I would encourage you to check that out. So at this time, I think I'll go ahead and just take questions that we have up here in the question bar. So the first question is, where does the application start? And let me take you back to the code editor really quick, and I can show you that what we're looking at, and I'm looking at here right now, the hybrid app. And if we take a look here at system.js config. Now, system.js config is where it's set up in order to tell the application of where to find the files and also where to find the initial file. So, and it's importing here the application name of ng1, ng2. So if I take a look at this one, you can see that it's set up here as the application name of ng1, ng2. It needs to go up to the app folder and then look in ng1, ng2 folder. And then for the defaults, the main file that it's looking for is main.js. Now, main.js is transpiled from main.ts. So we're looking at the TypeScript file here of main.ts, which is what sets it up in order to begin to run the application. And just like I showed you before, as the document loads, then it runs the ready function and then downgrades all of the different components and gets it ready to be bootstrapped. And then once we're ready to start the application itself, it calls bootstrap in order to set it up within the browser. So that's how everything gets started. Let's take a look at the next question we've got here. What about unit tests? Well, I didn't write any unit tests for this demo application. When you're talking about making a change from Angular 1 to Angular 2, when you go to components, when you make the change from components, when you go from the controller to a component, you're going to be dealing with an object rather than a constructor function. So that'll be one of the changes that you'll need to make in your unit test, because instead of getting back a function, you'll get back an object. And also with Angular 2, there's a method that you can call, that's the controller constructor off the component. And by using that, then you can access directly down into the controller itself in order for testing. So I don't have any specific examples for this. Again, that Pluralsight course that I showed you, Joe Eames' course about migrating and preparing for Angular 2 does have some examples on that. So I'd suggest you check that out if you have the opportunity. Now, what about routing migration issues? The new router just dropped with RC3. So I haven't done anything with it specifically. I've just been using the Angular 1 router with all the development that I've been doing. So I can't say anything firsthand, but the new router is completely re-implemented. Some of the ways they go about it is a little bit different. So you have to dig into that as more information becomes available. And the last question we have here is, should I upgrade promises to observables? Now, Angular 2 provides observables which do exactly what they say. They give you an API for being able to observe changes in data. So let's say that you have a collection of data that's being returned from a server, but it's coming back at different times. You might want to use an observable there because then your application will know and it'll recognize the changes that come through, even though there could be a relatively long period of time between the return of data. A promise, though, it'll make an asynchronous request. Then you return the promise once you have all the data that you need, and a promise returns only one time. So just because you're using promises in Angular 1 doesn't necessarily mean that you want to change them to observables. But if you have a need where that type of construction makes sense, then you want to use an observable. If you say need to return back multiple returns from a call to the server, or there's long periods of time where that data might come back. So that's the use case that you would use to decide one between the other. Well, thanks again for joining me for this webinar. Again, please feel free to contact me on Twitter if you want to continue to catch up. And also, once again, the code is all available on GitHub at Craig Shoemaker, and look for Angular Upgrade Demo.